The sky had forgotten the sun. For months, it remained a bruised tapestry of slate and charcoal, pouring down a lukewarm, persistent rain that smelled of rotting vegetation and ancient, disturbed graves. In Oakhaven, the rhythm of life, once dictated by the golden sway of harvest, had been replaced by the sound of water, dripping from eaves, squelching under boots, and rushing through the ruined furrows of fields that promised nothing but hunger. Father Thomas stood by the narrow window of the stone rectory, the scent of unwashed wool and stale incense clinging to his robes. He watched the village square, where the mud had become a predatory thing, swallowing the wheels of carts and the spirit of the people. There is a specific silence that accompanies a famine. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a hollow, ringing void. The birds had long since fled or fallen, their tiny carcasses dissolving into the mire. The philosophy of the void. One might ask if freedom exists when the stomach is empty. We often think of liberty as a political state, yet in the Middle Ages, freedom was the ability to transcend the immediate demands of the flesh. When the grain stores failed and the cattle began to cough their lives away in the damp barns, the boundary between man and beast thinned. Time, once a cycle of prayer and labor, stretched into a linear, agonizing crawl toward an inevitable end. The sound, the rhythmic, wet thud of a spade hitting saturated earth, someone was burying a child, or perhaps a hope. The smell, the cloying, sweet-sour stench of ergot, the fungus that turned the remaining rye into a toxic, hallucinogenic poison. The sight, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that looked more substantial than the gaunt figures moving in the gloom. By November, the frost had arrived, but it brought no purity, only the hardening of the mud into jagged ridges that cut the feet of the desperate. In the manor house, Lord de Clare sat before a fire that lacked warmth. He was a man of power, yet he could not command the clouds to part or the mold to stop its advance. Power, he realized, was a mask worn by a frightened child. The villagers no longer looked at the church with reverence, they looked at it with the dull eyes of the betrayed. If God was a father, why was he withholding bread? If the king was a protector, why were his tax collectors still demanding a portion of the nothingness they possessed? Faith is a luxury of the fed. To the starving, the cross looks less like a symbol of salvation and more like two pieces of wood that could be burned for 10 minutes of warmth. The internal monologue of the village weaver, Elspeth, was a litany of losses. She felt the cold not as an external force, but as an intruder living in her marrow. She had sold her loom for a bag of oats that turned out to be half sawdust. Now, she sat in the dark, counting the ribs of her youngest son by touch, the skin feeling like parchment stretched over a cage. December was the month the dogs disappeared. At first, it was whispered that they had run away to the woods, but the truth was written in the grease stains on hearthstones and the ashamed silence of neighbors. To eat a companion is to admit that the social contract has burned to ash. Death, in this era, was not a stranger, it was a constant guest. But usually, death had a ceremony, a shroud, a bell, a prayer. Now, the dead were left in the lean-to sheds because the ground was too frozen to dig and the living were too weak to try. The distinction between the living and the dead blurred. Both were pale, hollow-eyed, and moved with a terrifying, slow economy of motion. The smell of the village had changed. The damp rot was replaced by the metallic tang of extreme cold and the faint, underlying scent of ammonia. People stayed in their huts, huddling together for warmth, their breath blooming in the air like ghostly flowers. In this isolation, the mind begins to wander into dark cathedrals of thought. If life is a gift, why does it feel like a debt that is being collected with such cruelty? The Chronicles of 1315 speak of things that history prefers to forget. In Oakhaven, the breaking point came when the last of the leather boots had been boiled and eaten, and the bark of the trees had been stripped bare. It started with the foundlings, those without kin. Then, it moved closer to the heart. The hunger is not just a physical pain, it is a madness. It rewrites the moral code. The love of a mother, usually the strongest force in the medieval world, found itself in a lethal duel with the instinct to survive. The sensory detail, the sound of a knife being sharpened against a stone in the dead of night, a sound that carried through the thin walls of the Waterlandab houses. The emotion, a cold, crystalline clarity. There was no rage, only a mechanical necessity. To survive another hour was the only commandment left. Lord de Clare died in his bed, not of hunger, but of a broken heart and a fever he could not fight. His death was a quiet affair. No bells rang because the bell ringer had died 3 weeks prior. The authority that had held the village together, the feudal bond, dissolved. Father Thomas, now a skeleton draped in silk, sat in the empty nave of the church. He no longer prayed to the heavens. Instead, he watched the dust motes dancing in a rare, weak shaft of light. He thought about time. How 1,000 years of civilization could be undone by 3 months of rain. We are but a thin veil of rituals draped over a void of hunger. He realized that freedom was not found in the absence of pain, but in the final surrender to the inevitable. To die was to finally be free of the rain, the mud, and the gnawing in the belly. When spring finally arrived in 1316, it was not a triumph. It was a revelation of what had been lost. As the snow melted and the earth softened, the secrets of the winter were unearthed. The village was half empty. The fields were overgrown with weeds that thrived on the decay of the fallen. The survivors walked like ghosts through a world that no longer made sense. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had fed them. The children who remained were silent, their eyes holding 1,000-year stare. A bitter conclusion. The Great Famine eventually passed, as all storms do. The wheat grew again, and the rain became a friend to the soil once more. But the soul of the people was permanently scarred. They learned that the thin line between human and beast is not drawn by God or law, but by a crust of bread. The beauty of the world remained, the sunsets were still pink and gold, the brooks still sang, but it was a cruel beauty, indifferent to the suffering of those who walked upon it. We are but temporary witnesses to an eternal, unfeeling cycle. The history of that winter is not written in books, but in the silence of the woods where the village of Oakhaven once stood, and in the bitter knowledge that, under enough pressure, we are all capable of consuming the very things we love to stay alive for one more cold, dark night.